I'm very glad to be spared, unlike Leonard Sachs in the good old days, explaining to a restive musical audience as to why our greatest act was delayed en route. But we're delighted, we're honoured to be able to welcome Steve as our visiting scholar. Policy Exchange is, of course, about defying stereotypes, defying myths. During the 25 years that I've worked alongside and known both Charles and Steve, I can only make one comment. I've never seen Steve barefooted in the office. I have seen Charles barefooted on many occasions, and very fetching feet they were too, if I may say so, and that is not a modernising gesture, even though this evening is about the contrast between modernity, tradition, and forward-looking. So we're honoured to have you here, Steve. We look forward to hearing you have to say, and a long and happy visiting scholarship here through the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean. Thank you, Charles, for being here. It means a lot to me. And thank you to all of you for coming. I'm incredibly sorry to be so late and to keep you waiting. I'm afraid, as with many other things, you can blame the BBC. They delayed an interview and it all got a bit late, and I'm really sorry about that. But it was interesting. It was an interview with Emily Maitlis, and she asked me in the course of this live interview, did you see the tweet from Alan Duncan? I did not see the tweet from Alan Duncan. I don't know if Alan is here to explain himself, but the tweet said, Steve Hilton left 3 years ago, they dumped everything he did, and that's why they won the election. So I don't know. I would love the opportunity to debate that with Alan if he were here, but there's some other interesting tweets that have come along. Someone today asked if I was some weird combination of Marxist and libertarian. I don't know about that. Maybe that will become apparent during the course of the evening. And Suzanne Moore tweeted that she felt that I seemed to be turning into Russell Brand. So I don't know if that's the case either, although I think, he's got a lot of interesting things to say. But my favourite was someone who tweeted that when they come to make the film of the book More Human, who should they cast in the role of me? And the answer was Bruce Willis, which I don't know to take as a compliment or not. I think he's getting on a bit, so I'm not sure how much of a compliment it is, but there's been some interesting engagement. It's been nice to see how many people, to see the way people have responded to the arguments, and I'm really excited that I can be here to hear from all of you. I'm not going to talk for too long. I feel like I've been talking a lot the last few days, so I'd love to hear your questions and have a discussion around that. But I just wanted to set out, I guess, the big themes of this book and my argument. And going back to the Russell Brand comparison, I think that what's being got at there is this notion of a revolution. It's a word that I use in More Human. He obviously wrote a whole book about that. I'm not going to talk about Russell Brand anymore, but I do believe that we need a revolution. I think that is not an overstatement of the kind of change that we need to see if we're going to deliver the kind of society and economy that we all, I think, want to see happen in this country. Although I also believe that the argument applies in all countries. This is not a UK-focused argument. And when I talk about revolution, what I really mean by that is that it feels to me, as someone who's been inside the machine, as it were, trying to make change happen, that we're at the limit of what can be reasonably delivered from a system that has been built over the decades that is completely out of date, a bureaucratic, centralized system of running government and delivering public services, but now increasingly as well, you see it in the private sector, sort of vast machines being built to deliver the things that matter to us. And I think that is the central problem. And so it is possible, I think, and the evidence of the last 5 years of the Conservative government with the Liberal Democrats shows this, that you can squeeze some better results out of this system. The last government did deliver better results in most areas of public policy. It was a good, strong, reforming government that did a great job, not just rescuing the economy, but actually reforming public services, the way governments run. Better results were delivered. So it is possible to squeeze better results out of the system that we have, but the kinds of changes that you get from doing that, if you don't go for the revolutionary approach, I think are always going to be incremental. And I think that we need something much bigger and better than that, something transformational. And so that's a sort of big argument about the the sort of scale of the change that we need to see. And there's a parallel, I think, with something that is very much the way of operating where I'm now based in Silicon Valley. I now have well, it's a terrible cliche, really. Having moved to Silicon Valley, I'm now the co-founder and CEO of a tech startup. So I never thought I'd be doing that, but I am. And so I'm learning about technology and how you build great technology. And one of the things that those who have done that say, those who have built great technology companies, they say it's much, much easier to do something from scratch, to change something completely, to build something new, than it is to try and improve something that's already there. Because if you're trying to improve something that's already there, you are inheriting all the bad decisions and the bad design and the mistakes that have accumulated over the years. And although it sometimes seems daunting to make a big switch, to make a big change, it actually is easier than trying to fiddle and tinker with something that is fundamentally broken. And I think that is very much part of the approach that I think we should bring to how we think about government, about public services, and about all the public policy questions that we think about. And also, as I keep saying, it applies in the private sector too. This is an argument that it's not just about politics and government. It's about the whole of our lives and the experiences that we have as we go through our lives. But I did just want to touch on a couple of things. Just a few areas, a few big areas, and see what this kind of might mean in practice. I wanted to start with government itself, how government works. There's a story in the book which I think captures a big part of what I'm trying to say. It's someone I know very well, David Robinson, who runs a brilliant organisation in the East End of London, Community Links. He's been working with some of the poorest families there in our country, in Europe actually, for over 25 years. And he told me a story of a boy who was, I think, 11 years old. And he was, like so many in those communities, going off the rails, getting in trouble in a bad way. And was coming to the attention of all the bits of government that you'd expect, the social services and the criminal justice system and so on. And there was a conference arranged with all the people that were responsible for helping him, all the people whose job it was in government to help get this boy back on track. And there were 11 people in that meeting, the probation officer and social care and all the rest of it, you can imagine. 11 people in the meeting, and the mother of the boy phoned David Robinson and said, "David, would you please come to the meeting as well?" And he said, "Why? You've got all these people. There's nearly a dozen people. You don't need me as well." And she said, "Yes, I do. I need someone who's on our side." And I just thought that was incredibly sad to feel that this person thought that all these people that were there to try and help were actually not on her side. Now, you know that those officials and public sector workers and various people who were there, they really did mean well. I'm sure they were sincere about their efforts to help that boy, but actually what they do when they come to a meeting like that, and you see this time and again across government and the public sector, is that they bring to the table their own bureaucratic priorities, mindset, what they can achieve through their system that's been designed with their needs in mind, not the whole life of that boy. And it's a real allegory, I think, for what's gone wrong with government. Because even though those people all mean well, they're not allowed to do. The structures that they're in don't allow them to give that boy and that family the human, personalized help that they need. And the mother really understood that. And that's why she wanted someone there who was on her side, not the representatives of these various organs of government. And so one of the crucial things I think we need to do is address this very, very aggressively. We have to do something about the fact that this story is being repeated all over the country in so many different ways in so many different parts of government. And the real point here is one of concentration of power, of the way that these public services and these government organizations just keep rolling forward with their own bureaucratic impetus, centralizing power in a way that doesn't relate and is far removed from the experience of the individual. And that's why such a big part of the story of this book and the changes that I would like to see is decentralization, putting power in people's hands, taking power from where it's held in the center and decentralizing. Now, you may say that story doesn't make sense in that context, because those 11 people around that table, they were all local representatives of government. It wasn't some Whitehall Mandarin sitting around the table in East London. They were representatives of Newham Council and local social services. But that's my point. Even that is too centralised. So when you hear that we're going to have directly elected mayors in the 10 biggest cities, I think that's fantastic. I'm so excited that George is driving that forward, and that Greg Clark will be there in leading the department to make all that happen. But that should be just the beginning. Even local councils are too centralised to deliver the kind of human contact and the one-to-one approaches that we need if we're going to solve these problems that have been with us for decades and have not been addressed by these big centralised bureaucratic institutions. And so, I mean, there's a point here that I always think is interesting when you talk about mayors. When you look at the number of people in the unit, the lowest unit where you have executive government in France, and compare it to the UK, the average population in that unit, the lowest tier of executive government, in France, the number is 1,500. That's the average number of people that have some form of executive government running their affairs. In England, it's 160,000. There's a vast difference. We are so centralised, and that doesn't just mean here in London. It even means at the local authority level. We're never going to be able to give people the kind of services and government response that they expect with these centralised structures. And so I think that revolution is a good word for the scale of the handing out of power, the decentralisation of power that we need to see in government. In public services, it's exactly the same. Look at what's going on in healthcare with the advance of technology that makes personalised medicine a real, not just science fiction, but reality. There's a company I know who, in Silicon Valley, there's a guy who's founded a company that is about to come to market where he's combining genetic advances, genetic medicine, with 3D printing so that you will be able to have personalised medication precisely for you, for your genetic makeup, that you literally print at home. That's what's happening in healthcare. And there's so many other examples of technology running far, far ahead of anything that our institutions are currently capable of handling. It's just a small example of what's going on. But the reason I mention it is that you compare that to the kind of delivery of healthcare that we have today with these huge factory hospitals, treating people in an inhuman way. You just see it all the time, the stories about how people are treated in the system. It's because of the system. It's not because the people don't care. It's because the structures that they're within don't allow them to care. And that's why we have to address the structures. And the last way that that's going to really work is if we continue to do it through the kind of top-down instruction and centralized policy making that we've been using up to now. That's not working. And that's why we need to change it. You see the same in schools and in every other aspect of public services, as I said today in a piece in the Daily Telegraph. I love free schools. I love that we made such great progress in the last government on free schools. And so I want to see a lot more. Not just one good school in every neighborhood, not just a few to choose from, but 20, 30 schools, so that you can have really such a broad range of schools that teach children according to the particular strengths and weaknesses they have and what their characters are like. Children learn in different ways. And the idea that you can have these big, chunky schools, these factory schools with standardized tests and curriculum, and actually get results that will prepare children from the 21st century, when it's not about the academic knowledge so much as the character that they need to thrive in a fast-changing world, you're never going to get that from this centralized system. It's just not going to happen. And then the final point I just wanted to make related to business, and to make sure that everyone understands that the argument in this book is not just about government, it's not just about politics, it's also about actually the stuff that affects our lives probably more than any of those things. The daily interactions we have with companies large and small. You see the same trend towards big, bureaucratized, dehumanized approaches in the private sector too. And so there's an argument that I think we need to engage in about what do we do to help people and help companies improve their impact on their workers, on their customers, on their suppliers. That's part of public policy too. And I don't think we can just ignore it or consider that any kind of challenge to how business operates is somehow anti-business. Of course it's not. No one here is anti-business or even pro-business. It's not the right terminology. I think we should be pro-market because we know that the market is what delivers the economic wealth creation that pays for everything else that we rely on. Of course we should be pro-market, but that means challenging some of these incumbent in companies that actually don't see themselves prospering by inventing brilliant new products and services and supplying them in a way that delights people and treating their workers well and their suppliers, but actually through using lawyers and lobbyists and getting government to protect them through regulations and all the rest of it. And you see that all over the place. So we need to apply this same argument of bringing things back to a human scale where you get rid of these old ossified ways of doing things to the private sector too. I'm going to stop there because there's lots more in the book. I want you to read it, so I'm not going to tell you all about it. But I'd love to see what Charles makes of all of that and hopefully have some time for questions too.
Yes, Steve, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll ask Steve some questions and then I'll throw it open to you at some point. Is that are you happy with
Yes, you're the boss, so whatever you think.
Lovely. Well, in your book, Steve, you say that you
That's a lot of post-it notes.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to make that point because you say that you were teased in government for sticking post-it notes all over the place.
Yes.
And that's your sort of way of brainstorming, so that is one I've mimicked.
Very good.
And learnt from. It's a fascinating book. And I love your tone, and I love your variation of tone, because sometimes you're guilty of what a pre-war Pope called satanic optimism, about how everything's going to be absolutely fine. And then sometimes I love you when you're angry, so you get very furious about all sorts of things, factory farming, bureaucracy, banker salaries, all sorts. So there's a sort of idea jumps out at every page, and a feeling. And a passion. So I highly recommend this book, and you will enjoy it, and you'll get a lot of thought out of it. However, I do want to start by accusing you of not proposing the revolution that you're talking about. And the reason I say that is I think that when you talk about localism and decentralization, you don't address the issue, which is the most difficult thing about this, which is money. Mm-hmm. When we decentralize things in this country, we never ever really decentralize the raising of the money. And the only serious attempt to do that in my lifetime was something which wasn't considered very successful, which was called the poll tax. So what is your answer to that? If the money, everything you're talking about, you want to put it down to the lowest level, but in the end, those people have to come and get the money from the Treasury in order to do all the things, and the Treasury will decide which school gets it and all that sort of thing.
Honestly, no, I'm really sorry if that wasn't clear. I completely agree with you, and it is in there. I do say that. It's not just the power, but the money to deliver on it. I promise you it's in there.
Well,
I completely agree. I couldn't agree more.
You don't say...
The idea of giving power without the chance to actually do anything meaningful with it is ridiculous.
I think, sorry, forgive me, you obviously know your own book better than I do, but when you say, you say people should be able to manage their budgets, but you don't say much about how the budget's composed.
No, I agree. I mean, I don't have time to leaf through it, but I really agree, and it is in there.
So you would allow massive
yes.
local taxes, for example, to pay for...
Yes, absolutely. Now, the thing is that however, that there is a kind of... We mustn't be guilty, and I mustn't be guilty of that kind of... We must decentralize absolutely everything all the time. You need to be judicious about what is appropriately handled at which level. And there are some things that are obviously appropriately handled at the national government level. And the point that we do need to bear in mind is that it is important to have an element of national government acting to redistribute money, because otherwise you don't achieve the sort of fairness that actually national government needs to work to ensure. But I think a much bigger role for local authorities right down the chain, including very, very local, to raise money in the way that they choose to do the things that they want to do, democratically accountable, is a huge part of this.
When you say, I think it's in your absolute last page, you tell us what we should do. and
Yes.
you say that we should try and get elected for something, whether it's Parliament or local council or whatever. And one wants to agree with that, but I wonder if actually that is seriously good advice. If we're all trying to think about what is the most useful way we can help our community, is it really true to say that that's the way to do it? Because it isn't, is it?
Not necessarily for everyone, but the reason I make that point very forcefully and end the whole book with it, and in fact tonight literally have launched a website, the website that goes with the book, morehumancampaign.org. Its principal point is to help people navigate the system, to help people run for office. That's what I want to do. That's the sort of practical outcome that I'd like to see. Now, the thing is that the way I'd put it, I guess where I'm coming from with this is that I detect a rising interest of people, particularly the younger generation, the so-called millennials, in issues, in public policy issues, both domestic and international, real engagement. I see this very, very much in the US. I can't speak, I haven't been here the last 3 years, but people are really engaged. But I worry that they're expressing that engagement in a way that tries to sort of go round the political system, says, well, let's do something on social media, let's do this, and actually what you want is not them protesting against the system, but getting in it and then doing something to change it. And I think it's really important that we don't try and wish away the political process that we have and kind of pretend that it doesn't exist. And instead, we want people who have passions and a desire to see things change get involved in the system. Now, at the moment, they're so put off by the whole thing that they may think it's not really for them. And that's why I really want to do whatever I can to just encourage regular people to run for office. I think that would be great.
But you were put off by it, weren't you? I mean, you were in it and you buzzed off to
exactly.
somewhere where you could be free and happy.
Very good point. It's a very good point. Well, that wasn't the only reason. But and as I've said, people have asked me, well, you say everyone else should run for office. What about you? And I say, actually, what I've been saying is the truth, which is that my wife Rachel, who many of you know and love, says to me, if you don't run for office at some point, you will regret it. So you should do it. And I think she's probably right. But right now, I have a full-time job running a tech company. So that's what I've got to focus on. But I'm not saying I won't.
No, good. But didn't you, I mean, isn't that part of the problem you're talking about? You had some chance to change things within government, and you could also saw the difficulties of it.
Yes.
And you can't claim, you said earlier, and I'm sure it's true, that the last 5 years quite a lot has been achieved, but you certainly couldn't claim that the whole thing had been restructured.
No, I agree.
It's basically, in that sense, conservative with the small c, in the structural terms, the what's happened or rather what's not happened. So what makes you think that that these changes are at all likely to?
Well, I think that much more radical reform was achieved by the last government than people realise, actually. And a lot of it was behind the scenes. Look at the work that Francis Moore did, for example, in the Cabinet Office to change the way government works, procurement, opening up rooms, huge changes. When we came in, 70% of government contracts in IT were going, and this is huge, billions we're talking about, and the kind of spending that leads to all these massive disasters. 70% of that money was going to 7 large international companies. And now 60% is going to small and medium-sized firms. It's a really big turnaround, which was fought tooth and nail by the big businesses. Now, there are lots of things like that opening up. I don't want to make a sort of party political pitch here, but there are really, really big changes made. But I would put them, and the same with the free schools and all the rest of it, but I would put them in the category of trying to get better results out of the same system.
Yes.
I agree. Yeah. I agree with that. Now, the reason that I think that we might move further forward and faster now is because some of the constraints have been removed. First and most obviously, the Liberal Democrats, who really were a constraint on a lot of this more radical thinking. And secondly, perhaps more significantly, the fact that the overriding, quite rightly, the overriding priority for David Cameron was keeping a stable government together to turn the economy around. That was the number one aim and the focus, and really nothing should have been allowed to get in the way of that. Now, he would be the last to say, and George would be the last to say that that job is done, but I don't know what language, choose whatever metaphor you like, but we're out of the danger zone or whatever. And so I think with that economic progress comes the chance to do to take these reforms in the same direction, but much further, much faster. Certainly that's what I would like to see happen.
Actually, aren't you really saying that everything you said 5 years ago and couldn't be done then should now be done? You're saying, you're saying, because you're the post-bureaucratic age, for example, a phrase which never was fully understood or took off, though it's clearly talking about something important, but it didn't sort of take off politically. No. And the big society and everything, really, it's Hilton's having another go now that they've got a majority. Is that it?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Good. And might not lead you to some self-criticism. I mean, in the sense that you're very conscious in your book that elites have had too much power, and they're all too friendly with one another, and and promote one another and keep everybody out. But isn't part of the experience of what went wrong with the modernisation process was that it was rather an elite process, so that it tended to think about, and you were guilty of this, of things, which certainly matter, but attend, so like race, class, sexuality, but not really, race and sexuality, but not really about class and the issue of what happens to people who were lower down the bottom. And there was almost a conscious decision by the Conservative modernising project to go up market and stop thinking about, sort of grungy Luton car workers or whatever, because you wanted to seem smarter and less sort of in the ghetto. And that produced a whole load of reactions against you, which nearly lost you the election. Well, in fact, did you lose you the previous election? Because you ceased to be talking to people who weren't having such a great time in life and who were struggling and all that sort of thing. I mean, these are constantly repeated arguments, but they're sort of true. And isn't it even true in this that you are proposing sort of elite propositions? You're certainly extremely concerned for the welfare of many, many people. There's no doubt about the sincerity about that. But aren't you looking at it in a sort of, you say something very good about children, makes me think about this. You write very well about children. And you say how play, what an important thing play is, and play is a form of experimentation. And that's clearly the way you think about things, and that's very attractive. However, ultimately, government can't be play, can it? And the sense that privileged, well-off, well-educated people are playing is extremely irritating to all the less privileged, less well-off people who are working. And that's that's something the Tories have got themselves into some problems about, isn't it?
I don't know, there's so much in that, Charles. Probably some very fair points, I'm sure. But the thing is that, first of all, I think it's really important to recognize that there's, and it's not a small group, it's a really big group of people in the country whose lives are really terrible. Yeah. Like, if you like, to be simplistic about it, below the kinds of people you're talking about. And I think our first concern, frankly, should be with them, because they've been stuck for decades, and have been completely let down. Right,
so you don't agree with it, sorry, just that's quite interesting to pin down. You don't agree with the sort of Thatcher-type theory that the key motivating people that you have that are most important to society are the rising class who is seeking opportunity. You think the biggest duty is to the people, whatever the right word is, the underclass.
I think there's many different ways of looking at it. First of all, if you're talking about what you say in an election campaign, that's obviously a completely different question that I'm not that interested in, particularly not having done a particularly good one and just seen someone in the form of my good friend Linton do a very good one that was successful. So I don't think I should be the last person to talk about election campaigns. I'm talking about what you do in government. And of course you do many things and you advance on many fronts at once. And I think it all goes together. I guess the analogy would be allowing people to rise up. But that does, I think, start with people who are completely stuck and living terrible lives. And you have to do something about that, because it's not just because it's terrible for them. And I'm talking many millions. This is not just a handful. I mean, obviously, we have our program that we set up, the Troubled Families program, which initially focused on the 120,000 families with the biggest problems.
Louise Casey.
All of that, exactly. That's a very, very small subset of a wider group that has been stuck and in terrible circumstances for many decades. And you've got to help them climb the ladder, but then everyone climb the ladder. I mean, all the things that I say about, for example, on inequality. For example, there's a chapter on inequality, And there, the case I make is that exactly to this point, that you've got to, I think, we have to completely rethink the way we look at training, for example, because training is such a sort of boring word. People don't like talking about it. It's never a high-profile issue. But if you're talking about the kind of people that you're describing there, their livelihoods are being really threatened by big changes, for example, in automation and so on, where you've got huge swathes of the economy that are just going to stop offering jobs and opportunities for people. And so you've got to really address that. And it's not just about, so for example, there's a lot of argument, there's a big argument I make there about how we've got to stop seeing training as something that is just for kind of a vocational thing, whatever. It should be something that is a social norm that everyone does all the time in ways that, again, Silicon Valley companies are completely reinventing, companies like Udacity and so on, offering really different ways of doing that are completely separate from the kind of centralized system of providing those tools that we have today. That's just one example, but I think that it's not a choice between different priorities in that sense. I do take the point that some of it could have come over in the way you describe, but on the other hand, that also had its benefits in terms of people realizing that this was a leader and a party with priorities that were different to what they had imagined.
Yes. If you, I mean, on the post-bureaucratic point, I sometimes think I'd like you to say a bit more about bureaucrats, because I'm slightly feeling sorry for them after reading your book. I mean, I think I can imagine them sort of, there they are in the window of number 10, and they look out of it and they say, oh God, here that comes that man in his T-shirt and his bicycle. What does he doesn't have to deal with the consequences. One of the things about modern democratic government and the way governance is that it has to have process. It has to, because otherwise it's not fair. It doesn't work properly. There has to be written records of everything. There has to be consultation with all the relevant meetings. There has to be first reading, second reading, white paper, green paper. There has to be, etc. And you sort of say, oh, well, bugger that. You know, we're just, here are all these wonderful ideas. And that, they are wonderful, a lot of them. But I don't think you answer, how do you actually run things in a modern society? Because if you start doing Hiltonic type things, for sure, the government will be very strongly attacked. Mm-hmm. And in some ways rightly so by the media, because they'll say, look, they're letting this school that's, you know, letting children play with plasticine all day, getting more money than the one where, you know, that we think's better. Because you're letting it all hang out, you're in a funny way exercising more arbitrary power. And it doesn't really work like that in a democracy.
I think that there's, again, so much there. I think that, first of all, I just want to make a point about, about the bureaucrats. You're right, that word is, I don't know how many page references there are in the index for that word. I'm sure it's very high. It's really the bureaucracy, not the bureaucrats. Genuinely, and I'm not just saying this for, you know, for form's sake, the civil servants that I work with were incredibly smart, incredibly committed, dedicated to what they were supposed to be doing, and actually as frustrated as we all were. And it wasn't just me, by the way. This is everyone is driven mad by this. And so it was not about some kind of, you know, classic yes minister type clash between me and that was just not what it was like. They were driven mad by the need for all this process, just as you described, the consultations and all the rest of it. My answer is, well, why do you need them? And you say, well, you've got the argument is you have to have all this stuff because if not, things go wrong. But that, and so you're saying, well, there's this world without all this stuff and things could go wrong. Well, it's not as if we've got a perfect world now with all those controls and evaluations and all the rest of it. Many things go wrong now. It's not satisfactory. So of course there's risk, but that's one of the really big things that I think that, you know, someone like me can help with, that perhaps is, you know, outside rather than in, is actually to start to see if we can change the culture around risk, to say to people, yes, that's right. When we get rid of all this stuff that's holding people back, there will be variation in provision around the country. There will be different outcomes. Some things will go wrong. That's good. That is life. That's normal. Let's not try and pretend that through these bureaucratic centralizing systems, we can make everything perfect.
Yes.
That's very unconservative, and it's just wrong, and it produces these perverse effects. So I think that the arguments, you're right to describe the nature of them, but I think we don't run away from them. We have to confront them. All of us. I think it's down to us. We've got to lead a culture change around this.
And why should we think that David Cameron, who's really a very, by sort of background and attitude, a very conventional, typical, high-quality, moderate Tory politician, why should you think that he's likely to do much of this? I mean, you could have had somebody like this as Prime Minister at any time in the last 200 years.
No, I think he's very different to that. I think that he's really, he's as everyone who knows him understands, I think the reason he's so brilliant is because he's got this great combination, I think, of, I mean, the way I put it is a radical heart, but a responsible head. And that's what you want. You don't want just the radicalism, because that's, you need to make it happen. Anyone can write a book, but to actually...
No, it's quite hard, actually.
Well, but actually, as you said, making things happen in government with all the pressures and conflicting, agendas of people and all the rest of it, that's incredibly hard. And you can't just sort of... but I think that creative tension...
And now is the opportunity because it's a majority.
Yes, but I think that I really believe that. I know him very well, and I really believe that he's got that combination, and I hope that this gives the opportunity for the reform to be advanced at a faster pace.
Well, let's throw it open to the potentially revolutionary mob. And when I choose you, could you please say who you are? Yes, the chap there with your hand against the window, yes. Yeah. There's a microphone coming.
Hi, my name's Tony Ellis. Steve, I'm 25 years local government, so I get the localism bit. And I guess there's two structural issues that pose the question to you. In England, is the parish, town, district, county, local government model one that's going to help here, or in fact is acting as a barrier? And I guess the second one, which is I kind of felt like I've done with a whole group of this whole issue of public sector data, citizen data. So I believe citizens should own their own data. However, central government of all political persuasions, I think, still hasn't had an honest dialogue with us, saying these agencies still need to start sharing data. We're still tying ourselves up in knots. So in your example of that 11-year-old, there might, I don't know how many people in the room, but behind those people were 20 systems or lots and lots of silos. So is that aspect going to change, and the English local government bit?
Yeah, I think that they go together. One of the things that... actually, it's not in the book. I say at the beginning of the book, is this basically just a list of all the crazy things you wanted to do in government, but they wouldn't let you? I said, well, partly it is. And one of the things, others might judge whether it's crazy or not, was I thought we should take the opportunity of being this historic coalition government to really look at what I describe as the governance map, where power lies and how it's distributed and arranged, because you have these incredibly complex overlapping arrangements of who's responsible for what at different layers, and it really gets in the way of the kind of human approach to the people-centered approach that I think we need to see. And I wanted to do that, and I still think it should be done. I think it is a good project for someone to do, to actually look at, well, if you just had a blank sheet of paper, how would you, and just forget about all the historic stuff and what's accumulated over the decades, what makes sense in terms of the boundaries of democratically accountable units and what services they should run, and it may well mirror the existing arrangement. But I think it'd be good if you had more coordination between them, and that would help with your data point. But overall, I think that the general point I would make is that at every level, you want to have someone who is directly accountable, and that's why I say mayors everywhere, including at that parish level, as you have in many other countries. This is not some outlandish fantasy. This is normal. We're the weird ones. And so I think you need that combination of someone who's directly accountable at every level. But I do think we need to look at this map of governance and the responsibilities that go within, things like fire and police and welfare and social services. And I think so many of them could be put down much lower to the ultra-local level, especially the ones that are... Obviously, you're not going to do that with transport, which makes sense at the city or regional level, for example. But with things that are really personal, social services, family support, that kind of thing, I think it should be as low as you can possibly go. And for me, that's the neighborhood, actually.
On that point,
Another
We'll have a
discussion.
word then, will you?
Sorry?
You'll have a word.
Yeah.
on that point, actually, when elected police commissioners came in, I thought that was a terrifically good idea and absolutely the right, and everybody seemed completely uninterested in it, and sort of it never really took off. Is there a problem about this type of democracy that somehow actually people don't want
Well,
it?
as Lord Wasserman can testify,
Yeah.
I saw police commissioners as a terrible, poor substitute for what we really should have had, which is directly elected mayors controlling policing. And further, I thought that we should, as also Gordon will remember, that we should create police forces that matched human communities, not bureaucratic structures. Instead of trying to have whatever it is, 50 odd, how many is it? 43, sorry. Police forces that are sort of drawn up to try and be roughly equal. We should have, some really big ones that make sense, London, and some medium-sized ones that make sense, Brighton, and some really small ones in a village. That to me is the human way of looking at it. We should have many, many more police forces, each of them with a directly account responsible to a directly elected mayor. That would be my way of doing it. The police commissioners, I thought, were a poor substitute.
Thank you. Gordon, did you want to say anything on that?
First of all, I wanted to say I'm sorry that Steve didn't mention in the book, because that's down to him. That was a great tribute to Steve, because he fought. There was no one who supported the idea of getting policing out of the Home Office, which is what it's all about. It's not about police commissioners, getting it out of the Home Office and down to local level. No one supported it. The Conservative Party didn't support it. The other opposition didn't support it. AGPO didn't want it. The Federation, this morning at a Federation event, they talked about amalgamating it all. And it was all in the name of value for money. And what annoys me so much is it's nothing to do but individuals and service and making communities safe. It's where do we get best value for money? And that's leading the Scots now to amalgamate all their forces into one, miles from local community, and the same pressure here. And I want to give Steve, I'm sorry I say it's not in the book, because it was a real achievement in the early days of this government against opposition from every civil servant in the Home Office, everyone in the political parties, and he pushed it through. And I think you will see in the next 5 years that PCCs will come into their own, because they have made a real difference locally, even though it was very much, as we agreed at the beginning of all this, the second best solution. Right. The much better solution is to bring it all together under one single person and then have trade-off across services.
Thank you. Next question. Yes. Against the wall there. Thank you. Yes. The white blouse. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jessica from the John Lewis Partnership. You've talked a bit about the living wage, and I just wondered, in my sense, it feels like we're at a bit of a standoff, in that some businesses don't see the value of the living wage or won't invest in it, and government isn't going to make it a statutory measure. So I just wonder, is there a more progressive settlement around progression, low pay, that would allow government and business to kind of, meet in the middle and bridge these two poles?
Yeah, I'm not interested in meeting in the middle on this. I think it's a moral absolute, frankly. I think that it is completely wrong that people should work hard and not be able to live on that. And it's morally wrong that their income has to be topped up by the state in the form of benefits paid for by the taxpayer. I just think that's wrong. And so whether companies like it or not, I don't care. They should do it. Now, the next question is, what are the real world consequences? Now, there are plenty of examples. There's one I go through at length in the book of companies who pay the living wage, and way more. Costco is the best example. Costco is a huge, successful company in the US with some presence here that is in an absolutely, it's not some sort of boutique-y thing where they can charge enormous prices and get away with it. They are in the absolutely ultra-competitive grocery retail and general retail sector, where it's all about margins and it's all about competing on price. They're huge. They're number, is it 2 or 3 in the world? I can't remember. Number 2. Okay, number 2 in the world, and they pay their workers way beyond the living wage, like almost double the living wage, like 4 times the minimum wage, and that works for them. They've made it work for them. It's a choice they've made. So there are examples of businesses choosing to do it. But we can't rely on that. I think it's just not okay, given what I said about the moral imperative here. So I think we do need to require companies to do it. And so the next question is, well, if you do that, even though we know that they could make it work for them, because Costco is an example of that, if Costco can do it, so can anyone else, frankly. But let's just be generous and say there'll be costs of transition and all the rest of it. The last thing we want is to put people out of work. You don't want a situation where, okay, some people are being paid a living wage, but others are losing their jobs. And that's why I've made one suggestion. There may be others. Other people may have better ways of doing it, that you create kind of business-friendly living wage, as I describe it, where you require them to pay the workers more, but you also cut the taxes that they pay, the business taxes, so that the net impact on the company is neutral. Now, that is just an idea for discussion. But what I'm saying is, in the end, if you think this is the right thing to do, we've got to find a way to make it work. We shouldn't ask whether it's something that business welcomes or not. We should just say this is right and we should do it. Now let's find a way to do it in a way that's practical.
You make a good general case for business, with many criticisms of big business. Jessica's from John Lewis. You mentioned John Lewis, and whose work, as I understand, are called partners, I think is the word, which indicates their model, and everybody praises their model. Why doesn't everybody follow their model? Why is it just John Lewis and virtually nobody else of real importance behaving like this? Presumably you would like more people to follow such a model. I would,
but I wouldn't say it's the only thing that can give you the kind of
But there's a stickiness about bringing about these changes, isn't there?
Yeah, I think
within business, not just within government.
Yeah, I think that the issue is that you can't start going around interfering in these sorts of structures, because I think it's a general point that we need to understand about the market and the way the market works. And so what I come back to is not making a case for this model or that, but just saying it's not always the case, but it tends to be the case that in sectors where the big players are really protected from competition, either by actions of their own or by the structure of the market, that's when you typically get the bad behavior, the exploitation of suppliers and ripping off customers and paying the executives totally undeserved salaries. And that causes all this disillusion with capitalism, which I think is profoundly damaging, because in the end, we all support capitalism, we should do, and want it to succeed. That means making sure that we don't see these, we do what we can to get rid of this bad behavior, but you don't do it by, I think, these sort of fiddling around in individual ways. You do it by looking at the structure of the market.
Yes, please. The chap behind Richard Ehrman there, sorry, I don't... Yeah. Yes, you, thank you.
Steve, Mark Wallace from Conservative Home. You talked about how these changes could affect government. You talked about how they could affect business. How about how they could affect the way political parties go about things? I mean, we still have a model where we ask people to pay £25 for the privilege of being insulted by strangers in the rain. How would your kind of universal theory apply to that?
Well, it's a very boring answer, I'm afraid, because it does come back to the decentralization. I think that's one of the reasons that it would have benefits not just in terms of governance and public policy, but also for politics itself. If you had power localized and it made real, and with the opportunity to make real change happen at the local level, I think you would see more people getting involved, because it would be worth getting involved, and that would help re-energize local democracy and local parties and make politics more human. I also think that what we talked about earlier in terms of getting people to run for office, that is something that the party should be doing, reaching out and saying to people, look, you may think we're all a bunch of weirdos that speak this odd language and all look the same, but actually we want you to get involved, to reach out, not just to say, well, they know where to apply if they want to, but actively go and do it. And there's some other things we might look at. I mentioned in the book, I think it would be interesting to try some experiments, for example, with the caucus system that Iowa uses in its primaries and other bits of the US. I think that's a really interesting model where people actually physically come together to vote. It's a kind of community occasion that's face-to-face with the candidates and each other, and I think that's something we might try, for example, in a local election context. I think there's lots that we can do to try and make politics more human as well. Yeah.
I've been passed an order that we must draw peacefully to a close, but I'll take one more question, please. Yes, a gentleman with spectacles who's sort of in the middle there, youngish, slightly mustachioed. No, that's you. You're the young one. Don't be shy about it.
Thanks very much. Charles asked the question slightly, but I'd like to push the point a bit further.
Sorry, who are you on?
Oh, sorry, my name's Ben Walker, and I'm from Royal Mail. I wanted to push the point about this issue of failure, because I always think the problem with localism is that you're only one step away from being taken away as a result of some sort of disaster or something like that, and you look at, you know, a baby P scenario and how government responds. And I want to know how culturally we deal with that, both as politicians and as citizens, because often the immediate response is to look at government or to look at politicians to step in and do something. Yes. Your response seems to be that that's not what we should do. And if you look at some examples in the US, if you contrast the way Detroit has suffered in recent years, is that sort of the level of failure that you need to push, or when does government step in, or do you need those examples in order to ward away from others not following the right course of action?
Well, you don't want to sort of push failure for its demonstration purposes, but I think that I think a big part of this is just talking about it. I mean, you know, what we're talking about here is a culture change, and people being confident enough that those running public policy to be confident enough to make the case and not be forced to go running for the regulatory handbook or whatever the term would be every time something goes wrong. Now, to have that confidence, they need to know that they're operating in a culture where that argument is received and understood and accepted. And we're a long way from that right now. So step one, I think, is just people discussing this issue and talking about it and preparing the ground for it. People like Policy Exchange and others. You know, I think it's a culture change that we need. And that will make the politicians more likely to respond in the way that you're describing, I think.
Thank you, Steve. I think, Dean, you're wishing to wind up, is that correct? Oh, sorry, I got these messages saying stop.
It was a long 5 minutes.
Oh, let's have more questions. Excellent, good. The lady there with the, yes, with the spectacles. No, you, madam, yes.
Fiona Leach, I work for Radio 4 news programmes. How do you instigate a revolution without asking turkeys to vote for Christmas? But then you've sort of answered it maybe with the culture change. I mean, with so many vested interests in the system, whether it's lobbyists or civil servants or politicians, how do you initiate the
well, if you let's just take that thing of lobbying. So that, which I feel very strongly about, because it's not just that it leads to terrible outcomes. For example, the sort of devastating impact on our health and the environment of the kind of, what do I call it, the culinary industrial complex, you know, the big food industry, and what that's doing to everyone's health and the environment. And a lot of that is achieved through lobbying. Now, if you actually break down the power structures so that I mean, a good example is school meals, I think, a really sort of tangible example. So one of the disasters around school meals that Jamie Oliver so brilliantly campaigned on was because you have these huge contracts awarded to deliver school meals, nationally awarded contracts, where you've got these industrial food producers churning out this toxic junk that ends up being fed to our children because you've got these big contracts that only a big company could deliver. Now, if you break that whole system up, so basically each school runs itself, it's just impossible, actually, for that kind of lobbying. It makes no sense to have that kind of contract, and you end up with something that is much more small and localized and more human. So I think that a really big... So I think there's this...
lobbying to stop all these changes that you want?
Well, you just have to fight them off. I mean, we had that with... I mean, I'll give you specific examples. The thing I mentioned earlier about the IT contracts. Right, so when we proposed that, Microsoft, literally, I hope maybe there's someone here to confirm this from Microsoft. Microsoft phoned Conservative MPs with Microsoft R&D facilities in their constituencies and said, we will close them down in your constituency if this goes through. That's what they, and you had the same from all the other tech companies as well. Not all of them, but a couple of them. But definitely, I know that we had the stories from the MPs saying, I've just had this call from sometimes the global CEO phoning a Conservative MP saying, we will close down this plant. And we just resisted it. I mean, you have to be brave, I guess, and just say, sorry, we think this is the right thing to do. Yeah.
Standing there, yes.
I'm Matt Warren. I'm the MP for Boston and Skegness, and until a couple of weeks
I'm the corporate affairs director of Microsoft.
I know, it's all right. But until a couple of weeks ago, I was the technology editor of the Telegraph, so
right.
I don't know if there's an overlap. You want a revolution that makes everything much more local. Ironically, it seems to be a revolution that has to come top down.
Yeah.
What should I, as a local MP, be trying to do to help your cause?
That's such a great question. Well, first of all, support the, all the moves that the government will be making, and work with others to generate ideas along this theme. I think that, one of the things that I was really pleased we're able to get going, and it comes back to the point about politics, actually making politics more human. They're connected points. Was actually for MPs to see themselves as sort of political entrepreneurs in the community, getting involved in actual work that would address actual problems on the ground, the social action programs that we ran. And a lot of those were really, not everyone did it, I think a minority did it, but those that did found it really brilliant for their understanding of the needs of their constituents, and also for their reputation in the constituency, actually showing that you're not just there to sort of gather opinions and then go and reflect that in Westminster, but to really get involved in making change happen on the ground. And I think that is a great way to start.
The lady with the, dark glasses, yeah.
Georgina Downs, a freelance journalist and regular writer for The Ecologist. Hello. Just following on from what you were saying about the health and environmental impacts of our current food system, this is an area I've worked in for 14 years as a journalist and a campaigner, trying to get successive governments to act to protect rural residents like me, who have absolutely no protection at all from any of the cocktails of toxic chemicals that are currently permitted under government policy to be sprayed throughout every year on crop fields all over the UK and in the direct locality of where residents live and breathe. And this obviously includes babies, children, pregnant women, people already ill and or disabled, amongst other groups. Therefore, my question to you is this. Although the civil service will advise the Prime Minister to meet with industry and big farming business, the same does not apply when it comes to meeting someone like me who is representing people who are adversely affected by a government policy. The closest I came was meeting Gordon Brown's Chief Policy Advisor at Number 10 when Labour were in government, and which Sarah Brown herself actually set up against the advice of the civil servants. So what advice would you give on how the little people like me can secure a meeting with the Prime Minister when civil servants want to ensure he does not hear the case regarding residents, but only hears from those who either profit from or have other vested interest in the continued use of agricultural pesticides?
Yeah.
Give her his mobile number.
Yeah, exactly. I think that we did actually try. I think we did it. We set up a small business group to advise, so the Prime Minister could regularly see small business as well as the big business group that was already in play. I think that there's as a general point, and then there's a specific one I want to make in relation to agriculture. The general point is, yes, you're right that this is what's so wrong with the system, that the big established players can get a seat at the table because they are. Because they have such a systemic role. That's why government feels that it has to work with them and meet with them, because if something goes wrong, then that has big, widespread impacts. That's why I think that, and actually now I want to move on to the other point, I think really we can worry about the individual kind of symptoms of these problems, but I think one theme that goes right the way through the book is that that's been the problem. We tend to address the symptoms rather than the causes of these problems. And so in this particular case, we've got to get to the root causes. The root cause is this type of agriculture that is vast and intensive and depletes the soil, and that is what requires all these chemicals, because the nutrients are being taken out of the soil. That's what you've got to keep putting more and more chemicals back in to get the same results. And so, yes, you can sort of do something about the symptoms and do some regulation around the chemicals and all the rest of it. But that's not going to solve the problem long term. What you've really got to do is attack this system where you have these vast companies and the big fields and the industrialized food system that requires all this artificial enhancement because it's gone so far away from a human scale way of getting our food.
One more. By the way, sorry. It's all very well what you just said, but imagine a system where the big established players couldn't get a seat at the table. That'd be ridiculous, wouldn't it?
No,
they're very important.
Yes, but they're not the only thing that matters. Yeah. I mean, as you know, most employment in the country is from small and medium-sized firms, not big businesses, for example. And I'm just saying that I think it's wrong that, I mean, this is more true in America than here, but I think it's wrong that big businesses and rich people should be able to literally buy the outcomes they want from the political system. That's just wrong. And we need to equalize access, I think.
Sorry. Yes. Yes, you please, with the white shirt there. Thank you.
Hi, James Tarbett. I work for a large organisation, and I work in a team that tries to instill cultural change from the ground up. One of the biggest challenges we have is all the things you were talking about: steering committees, working groups, 5-point plans, strategy this, strategy that. A lot of that structure is put in place through fear of the regulation from government. At the start of your talk, you talked about the fact that government comes to get protection. So business comes to get protection in the form of regulation from government. Often that's the other way around, and it's what's impinging on business' ability to change. When you're looking at change in government, change in business, what comes first, and where does the effect move from one to the other?
Well, we tried very hard to get rid of all that stuff, or big chunks of that stuff, but it's very difficult because of the point we were discussing earlier about the fear of being some lobby group coming after you if you get rid of this requirement or that requirement. I mean, we set up a process for it. I can't remember what it was called, the Red Tape Challenge, I think, which was all about trying to distinguish, classic deregulation. I mean, every government in all time has said, we're going to crack down on this and get rid of red tape. None of them ever do. It always just accumulates and accumulates. We wanted to be different, so we had a totally different approach, which was, led to people. Well, we had a different approach, which my idea was instead of trying to sort of chip away at this edifice of regulation and say, well, let's get rid of this one and that one and the things that make no sense that require companies to respond in ways that are unhelpful and unnecessary and waste time and money. Instead of just like chipping away at that, why don't we do it completely differently and prompt some creative thinking by saying, rather than choosing the ones we want to get rid of, why don't we assume we're getting rid of all of them and choose the ones we want to keep? And that's a different way of thinking about it that would lead, I hoped, to a more productive outcome. And of course, literally within 3 weeks of starting to have the meetings with the officials from each department who'd come in with their bits of paper, and I'd look at the color coding. I said, oh, so are these all the ones that you want to get rid of? So, oh no, these are the ones we want to keep. And after you spent half an hour, literally half an hour, debating one out of 373 from in one meet, which was something to do with the fire risk attached to nightwear. And you think, that's it. This is how nothing's ever going to change, because you just can't, you haven't got the time to do that.
The flammable 90s have been doing very well. What's wrong with banning flammable 90s? I mean, isn't that a good thing?
Well, the argument that was made to me was that far from getting rid of this regulation, we should equalize it, because the regulations on flammable nightwear, as I recall, only protected female flammable nightwear, and male flammable nightwear deserved equal protection under the law. So that was the argument. Now, I just think that we have something called the market, and I think that actually in many cases it works. Not in all cases. I won't say you get rid of all regulation, and many of the things I propose you could describe as regulation. But I think that many of them are really unnecessary and will be perfectly well addressed by consumers choosing things that they like, and things that don't meet the right standard don't succeed in the market.
This really is it. So thank you all for coming tonight. Stalin used to say in the matter of arms production that eventually enough quantity becomes quality, and that is certainly true of the audience tonight. But we have both had quantity and quality, and the quantity and quality tonight is a tribute to our two star panelists tonight who have generously given of their time, placed policy exchange once again at the centre of affairs, which is where it should be. So thank you, Charles, thank you, Steve, for taking a risk for peace, as they would say, and coming to join.